December 24th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Dawn struggled through frozen mist that clung to the pine branches, like the breath of ghosts. 27,000 feet above the snow-covered landscape, the air was thin, metallic, and bitter cold inside the cockpit of a Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. First Lieutenant Francis Stanley Gabreski adjusted his oxygen mask, his eyes scanning the instrument panel's pale green glow against the pre-dawn darkness. The sound of 18 cylinders firing in perfect sequence echoed across the Belgian countryside as formations of American fighters carved through the winter sky. Below, the forests appeared as white tombstones stretching toward the horizon. Radio static crackled through the headphones, carrying urgent whispers from Allied ground controllers. Bastogne is still holding. They need immediate air support. Gabreski breathed deeply, tasting the metallic bite of pressurized oxygen. It was Christmas Eve, and the sky was calling. For 8 days, the German offensive known as Operation Watch on the Rhine had carved a bulge into Allied lines, trapping the 101st Airborne Division in the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. Weather had been the Wehrmacht's greatest ally during those dark December days. Thick clouds, freezing fog, and snow squalls had grounded Allied aircraft, leaving American ground forces without the air superiority they had grown accustomed to relying upon. In the Wehrmacht command bunkers scattered throughout the Ardennes, German officers had allowed themselves moments of cautious optimism. Major General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer Lehr Division had reportedly observed to his staff that without clear skies, American fighter bombers were merely expensive pieces of aluminum sitting uselessly on distant airfields. The weather had provided German armored columns with something they had not experienced since 1943, freedom of movement without fear of aerial attack. German tank commanders had grown bold during those 8 days of protective overcast. They moved their vehicles in broad daylight, confident that the dreaded Thunderbolts and Mustangs remained earthbound. Some panzer crews had even taken to painting Christmas wreaths on their turrets, a mockery of American holiday sentiment. The psychological impact was deliberate and calculated. If the Americans could be convinced that their technological superiority meant nothing when nature itself opposed them, perhaps the entire Western Front might collapse. But on December 24th, meteorological conditions began to shift. High-pressure systems moving in from the Atlantic started to clear the persistent cloud cover that had protected German ground forces. Allied weather reconnaissance flights reported improving visibility across the battle zone. The opportunity that American air commanders had been waiting for was finally presenting itself. The Republic P-47D Thunderbolt represented the pinnacle of American fighter bomber design in late 1944. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine producing 2,535 horsepower at maximum boost, the aircraft could carry external ordnance loads exceeding 2,500 pounds while maintaining formidable air-to-air combat capabilities. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns were mounted in the wings, each weapon capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with devastating effect against both aerial and ground targets. The engineering philosophy behind the Thunderbolt emphasized durability and firepower over maneuverability. Republic Aviation's designers had created an aircraft that could absorb tremendous battle damage while delivering crushing attacks against enemy positions. The radial engine's robust construction meant that individual cylinders could be destroyed without immediately disabling the power plant. The aircraft's substantial weight, often criticized by pilots accustomed to lighter fighters, became an advantage during high-speed diving attacks against ground targets. American industrial capacity had produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts by December 1944, equipping dozens of fighter groups across multiple theaters of operation. The 56th Fighter Group, based at RAF Boxted in England, had achieved particular distinction flying the type. Their pilots had developed tactical doctrines that maximized the aircraft's strengths while minimizing exposure to its few weaknesses. These combat-proven techniques would prove crucial during the desperate days of the Battle of the Bulge. The strategic situation surrounding Bastogne had grown increasingly precarious as German forces tightened their encirclement. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Acting Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, held defensive positions around the town with approximately 12,000 troops. These paratroopers, originally intended for rapid insertion and short-duration missions, found themselves engaged in sustained defensive warfare against multiple German divisions. Critical supply shortages plagued the American defenders. Ammunition stocks were dangerously low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and winter clothing was inadequate for the brutal weather conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the surrounded troops lacked effective anti-tank weapons capable of stopping the German armor that was methodically reducing their defensive perimeter. Without immediate resupply and close air support, the fall of Bastogne appeared inevitable. German forces arrayed against the American positions included elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and the elite Panzer Lehr Division. These units possessed significant firepower advantages, including Tiger II heavy tanks, self-propelled artillery, and experienced infantry formation that had been reinforced specifically for the Ardennes offensive. German commanders were confident that concentrated attacks supported by armor would overwhelm the isolated paratroopers within 48 hours. The weather break on December 24th created opportunities that Allied air commanders immediately sought to exploit. 9th Air Force headquarters issued operations orders for maximum effort missions against German forces threatening Bastogne. Fighter-bomber squadrons across England and liberated France prepared for intensive ground attack operations. Pilots who had spent 8 frustrating days watching weather reports finally received word that combat missions were authorized. First Lieutenant Francis Gabreski lifted his P-47D from the frosted runway at RAF Bastogne at 0847 hours on December 24th. His aircraft, bearing the tactical designation HVA and nicknamed Gabby, carried a full ammunition load and 2 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs mounted on underwing pylons. The mission briefing had been succinct: locate and destroy German armored vehicles moving toward Bastogne from the northeast. Rules of engagement authorized attacks against any military targets of opportunity observed within the designated combat zone. The formation consisted of 16 Thunderbolts arranged in 4 flights of 4 aircraft each. Radio discipline was strict, as German monitoring stations were known to triangulate Allied formations using transmission analysis. Visual navigation was primary, with predetermined checkpoints marking the route toward the target area. Weather conditions remained marginal, with broken cloud layers between 3,000 and 8,000 feet, creating visibility challenges for both navigation and target acquisition. As the formation crossed into Belgian airspace, the landscape below revealed the devastating impact of 8 days of armored warfare. Destroyed villages appeared as dark smudges against the snow-covered terrain. Roads were cratered from artillery bombardment, and numerous vehicle hulks dotted the countryside. Smoke columns rising from burning buildings provided grim testimony to the intensity of ground combat. German anti-aircraft defenses had been significantly reinforced during the offensive. Mobile flak batteries accompanied advancing armored columns, creating lethal defensive umbrellas around high-value targets. The 88mm guns that had originally been designed for anti-tank warfare proved equally effective against low-flying aircraft. German gunners had developed sophisticated techniques for engaging fighter bombers during their most vulnerable attack phases. At 0923 hours, Gabreski's formation encountered their first target, a column of approximately 30 German vehicles moving west along a secondary road. The convoy included various truck types, several tracked vehicles that appeared to be self-propelled artillery, and at least 4 tanks positively identified as Panther medium tanks. The vehicles were spaced at tactical intervals and showed evidence of camouflage discipline, indicating experienced leadership. The attack developed according to doctrine established through months of combat experience. The formation split into 2 plane sections, with each pair approaching the target from different directions to complicate defensive fire. Gabreski led the initial diving attack, rolling inverted and pulling through into a 60-degree dive angle that would maximize both accuracy and aircraft survivability. At 4,000 feet altitude, Gabreski acquired the lead German tank in his gun sight and commenced firing. The 850 caliber machine guns created a devastating cone of destruction that walked across the target area in less than 3 seconds. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds sparked against steel plate, while high explosive shells detonated among the softer-skinned vehicles. The psychological impact on German troops was immediate and severe, as the sudden appearance of Allied aircraft shattered their assumption of continued air superiority. German defensive fire proved intense, and accurate. Multiple 88mm positions opened fire simultaneously, creating a lethal barrage of black smoke bursts that filled the sky around the attacking aircraft. Smaller caliber weapons, including quad-mounted 20mm guns, added to the defensive volume. The characteristic sound of metal fragments striking aluminum skin was audible even above the roar of radial engines at combat power. During his second strafing pass, Gabreski felt the distinctive shudder that indicated battle damage. Control responses became sluggish, and oil pressure readings showed concerning fluctuations. Visual inspection of his right wing revealed multiple punctures from shell fragments, with fuel beginning to stream from a damaged tank. The tactical situation required an immediate decision: abort the mission and attempt to reach friendly territory, or continue the attack despite aircraft damage. Military leadership often demands split-second decisions made under extreme stress with incomplete information. Gabreski could observe additional German vehicles approaching from the east, vehicles that would reach Bastogne's defensive perimeter within hours if not intercepted. The mathematical calculation was stark. 16 American aircraft attacking now might prevent dozens of German tanks from overwhelming 12,000 surrounded paratroopers. Gabreski keyed his radio transmitter and broadcast a message that would be remembered by surviving squadron members decades later. "This is Gabby. I'm staying. Continue the attack." The transmission was brief, professional, and devoid of dramatics. It represented the distilled essence of military duty, mission accomplishment despite personal cost. The subsequent attack phases demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated air-to-ground operations. Remaining Thunderbolts systematically destroyed the German convoy, transforming tactical vehicles into burning wreckage scattered across several hundred meters of frozen countryside. Secondary explosions from ammunition vehicles created spectacular pyrotechnic displays visible for miles. German survivors abandoned their remaining vehicles and sought shelter in nearby forests. Radio intercepts later revealed German tactical communications, describing the attack in terms of overwhelming firepower and precision. One intercepted transmission reported that American fighter bombers had appeared as if from nowhere and destroyed an entire battalion's worth of equipment in less than 10 minutes. German commanders began requesting immediate reinforcement of anti-aircraft assets and expressing concerns about continued daylight movement. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate material losses. German troops who had grown accustomed to freedom of movement during 8 days of bad weather suddenly found themselves vulnerable to aerial attack once again. Morale reports compiled by German intelligence services noted increased anxiety among frontline units and growing reluctance to expose vehicles during daylight hours. Meanwhile, Gabreski's damaged Thunderbolt continued to lose fuel and hydraulic fluid. Engine performance gradually degraded as oil pressure dropped below minimum operating parameters. The aircraft's weight shifted as fuel leaked from punctured tanks, creating control challenges that required constant pilot compensation. Despite these difficulties, Gabreski maintained formation discipline and continued participating in follow-on attacks against additional German targets. The mission's success became apparent as radio reports from other formations described similar results across the entire combat zone. Fighter bombers from multiple squadrons were systematically interdicting German supply lines, destroying armored vehicles, and providing close air support to embattled ground forces. The 8-day period of German tactical advantage was ending as dramatically as it had begun. Weather conditions continued improving throughout the morning, allowing larger formations to enter the combat zone. B-26 Marauder medium bombers arrived to attack fixed installations, while P-51 Mustangs provided escort services and conducted their own ground attack missions. The combined effect represented American air power operating at maximum effectiveness, coordinated, overwhelming, and precisely directed against high-value targets. German commanders recognized the tactical shift immediately. Radio communications intercepted by Allied intelligence services revealed urgent requests for reinforced anti-aircraft protection and recommendations to suspend daylight movement until weather conditions deteriorated again. Some German units received orders to abandon exposed positions and withdraw to defensive lines offering better concealment from aerial observation. The broader strategic implications were equally significant. German offensive operations depended upon rapid movement and concentrated attacks against isolated American positions. Once Allied air superiority was re-established, German armored formations became vulnerable to systematic destruction. The Wehrmacht's entire operational timeline for the Ardennes offensive had assumed continued bad weather protection. At 10:47 hours, Gabreski's aircraft finally succumbed to accumulated battle damage. Multiple system failures, including complete loss of hydraulic pressure and engine oil starvation, made continued flight impossible. The aircraft began an uncontrolled descent toward the forest-covered terrain below. Gabreski attempted to restart the engine multiple times, but the power plant remained silent, except for the sound of wind passing through damaged cylinders. Emergency procedures required pilots to abandon damaged aircraft when safe recovery appeared impossible. Bailout at sufficient altitude virtually guaranteed survival, assuming successful parachute deployment and evasion of German ground forces. However, ejecting from the aircraft would immediately terminate any possibility of continued combat effectiveness. The decision carried implications beyond individual survival. Gabreski made a choice that exemplified the highest traditions of military aviation. Rather than abandon his aircraft, he attempted a dead-stick landing in a small clearing approximately 15 kilometers northeast of Bastogne. The landing approach was complicated by damaged control surfaces, irregular terrain, and the complete absence of engine power. Success required precise energy management and exceptional piloting skill. The landing attempt failed when the aircraft struck a stand of pine trees during final approach. Impact forces destroyed the airframe and killed Gabreski instantly. However, his sacrifice had already contributed to mission success that would have strategic consequences extending far beyond individual heroism. The German convoy he had helped destroy would never reach Bastogne's defensive perimeter. News of the successful air attack spread rapidly through American ground forces. Radio operators monitoring tactical frequencies reported hearing cheers from infantry positions when fighter bombers appeared overhead for the first time in 8 days. The psychological boost to American morale was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had endured constant artillery bombardment while feeling abandoned by higher command suddenly realized that air support had returned. The tactical success achieved on December 24th was replicated across multiple sectors as weather conditions continued improving. Allied air forces flew over 3,000 sorties during the next 48 hours, systematically destroying German equipment and disrupting offensive operations. The Luftwaffe, despite launching its largest single-day effort since 1943, proved incapable of effectively challenging Allied air superiority. German casualties from air attack during December 24–26 exceeded losses from all other causes combined during the same period. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed, thousands of troops were killed or wounded, and entire units were forced to abandon offensive positions. The Wehrmacht's logistical system, already strained by winter conditions and lengthened supply lines, began collapsing under sustained aerial interdiction. The relief of Bastogne became possible primarily because German forces attacking the town were systematically destroyed by coordinated air-ground operations. Elements of General George Patton's Third Army were able to reach the besieged garrison on December 26th, but only after air power had eliminated most of the German armor threatening the relief corridor. The famous meeting between Patton and McAuliffe was made possible by the sacrifice of pilots like Gabreski. Historical analysis reveals that the weather break on December 24th represented the decisive turning point of the entire Battle of the Bulge. German offensive momentum, which had carried advancing columns to within sight of the Meuse River, was permanently broken by the restoration of Allied air superiority. No German armored formation ever again advanced as far west as positions achieved during the first week of fighting. The engineering excellence of American aircraft design played a crucial role in these tactical successes. Thunderbolts and Mustangs demonstrated remarkable durability under combat conditions, often returning to base with damage that would have destroyed less robustly constructed aircraft. Maintenance crews worked around-the-clock schedules to keep maximum numbers of fighters operational, often completing major repairs in conditions barely above freezing. American industrial capacity provided the material foundation for sustained air operations. During December 1944, American factories were producing combat aircraft at rates exceeding 2,000 units per month. This production volume meant that aircraft losses, while tragic for individual pilots and crews, could be rapidly replaced. German industry, by contrast, was struggling to maintain even minimal production levels under constant bombing attack. The intelligence services that supported these operations deserve recognition for their contribution to tactical success. Photo reconnaissance flights, signal intercept operations, and human intelligence networks provided commanders with detailed information about German dispositions and movements. This intelligence enabled air attacks to be precisely targeted against the most critical enemy assets. Logistical systems performed with exceptional efficiency during the Battle of the Bulge air operations. Despite winter weather conditions and German attempts to disrupt Allied supply lines, aviation fuel, ammunition, and spare parts continued flowing to operational squadrons. The complex coordination required to maintain dozens of fighter groups in combat readiness represented organizational achievement comparable to the tactical victories themselves. The human cost of these operations extended far beyond individual pilot casualties. Ground crews worked in sub-zero temperatures to keep aircraft operational, often developing frostbite and other cold weather injuries. Air traffic controllers managed unprecedented numbers of simultaneous missions, while under constant threat of German air attack. Medical personnel treated wounded aircrew members under primitive field conditions. Training programs that had prepared American pilots for combat proved their worth during the Ardennes fighting. Standardized procedures for ground attack operations, radio communication protocols, and emergency procedures enabled pilots from different units to coordinate effectively despite language barriers and equipment variations. The systematic approach to aircrew education paid dividends when improvisation and flexibility became essential for mission success. The technological sophistication of American aircraft weapons systems provided decisive advantages during ground attack missions. 50 caliber machine guns using armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate most German armored vehicles from optimal firing angles. High explosive bombs with proximity fuses maximized blast effectiveness against personnel and equipment. These weapon systems represented years of engineering development focused on combat effectiveness. German defensive responses to renewed Allied air activity revealed both strengths and weaknesses in Wehrmacht tactical doctrine. Anti-aircraft units fought with exceptional skill and determination, often achieving high hit probabilities against attacking aircraft. However, German ground forces lacked adequate numbers of mobile anti-aircraft weapons to provide comprehensive protection for armored formations. The strategic implications of restored Allied air superiority extended beyond the immediate Battle of the Bulge. German commanders realized that future offensive operations would require either sustained bad weather or massive reinforcement of anti-aircraft defenses. Neither condition appeared achievable given Germany's deteriorating strategic position in late 1944. Weather forecasting capabilities played an increasingly important role in operational planning as the battle progressed. Allied meteorological services provided commanders with detailed predictions about cloud cover, visibility, and wind conditions that directly impacted aircraft performance. German weather services, by contrast, had been degraded by the loss of Atlantic observation stations and reduced communication capabilities. The coordination between air and ground forces during the Bastogne relief operations demonstrated the maturation of combined arms doctrine. Artillery observers in aircraft directed ground battery fires with unprecedented accuracy. Fighter bombers provided close air support that was precisely coordinated with infantry advances. Tank commanders received real-time intelligence about enemy positions from aerial reconnaissance. Individual acts of heroism, like Gabreski's final mission, were embedded within larger organizational achievements that made tactical success possible. The administrative systems that tracked pilot assignments, maintained aircraft records, and coordinated mission planning operated with efficiency that would be remarkable in peacetime conditions, much less during intense combat operations. The psychological warfare aspects of air superiority deserve particular attention. German troops who had experienced 8 days of immunity from air attack were psychologically unprepared for the sudden return of Allied fighter bombers. Many units abandoned equipment and positions unnecessarily when subjected to even limited air attack, multiplying the material impact of actual aircraft weapons. Medical services supporting air operations faced unique challenges during winter weather conditions. Pilots suffering from exposure, combat fatigue, and battle wounds required immediate treatment at forward airfields that lacked proper medical facilities. Flight surgeons worked under conditions that would challenge hospital emergency departments, often making life or death decisions with minimal diagnostic equipment. The maintenance of aircraft in sub-zero temperatures required innovative solutions to technical problems that had never been encountered during peacetime operations. Engine oil had to be heated before each flight to prevent congealing. Control surfaces required constant inspection for ice accumulation that could affect flight characteristics. These seemingly minor technical issues could determine mission success or failure. Radio communications during air operations represented another dimension of battlefield complexity. Pilots had to coordinate with ground controllers, maintain formation discipline, and receive tactical updates while operating in environments with intense electronic interference. German jamming efforts and the natural radio propagation effects of winter weather created additional communication challenges. The fuel logistics supporting sustained air operations were staggering in scope and complexity. Individual fighter aircraft consumed hundreds of gallons of aviation gasoline per sortie. Maintaining adequate fuel supplies for multiple squadrons required transportation networks that functioned despite winter weather and enemy interdiction attempts. The mathematical precision required for fuel planning rivaled that needed for any other aspect of military operations. Navigation during winter weather conditions tested pilot skills developed during years of training. Visual landmarks were obscured by snow cover. Radio navigation aids were subject to atmospheric interference, and compass readings could be affected by aircraft electrical systems. Pilots had to integrate multiple information sources to maintain accurate position awareness throughout their missions. From a strategic perspective, several alternative approaches might have altered the outcome of the Ardennes offensive, though weather remained the decisive factor beyond anyone's control. German commanders could have concentrated their limited air assets more effectively by establishing coordinated combat air patrols over critical supply routes. The Luftwaffe possessed sufficient aircraft for localized air superiority if properly concentrated, but dispersed their forces across too many objectives. The Wehrmacht might have achieved greater tactical surprise by implementing more sophisticated deception operations prior to the offensive. Allied intelligence services detected extensive German preparations weeks before the attack commenced, providing defenders with crucial advance warning. More effective operational security could have prevented American forces from establishing the defensive positions that ultimately contained German advances. German logistical planning proved fundamentally flawed, assuming that captured Allied fuel depots would sustain advancing armored formations. This dependency on enemy resources represented a critical strategic vulnerability that became apparent when German spearheads failed to achieve their optimistic advance schedules. Alternative fuel procurement strategies, including massive pre-positioned supply dumps, might have sustained offensive momentum beyond the initial breakthrough phase. The decision to attack during winter weather conditions, while providing temporary protection from Allied air power, created additional problems that German commanders inadequately anticipated. Vehicle maintenance requirements increased dramatically in sub-zero temperatures, reducing operational readiness rates across all armored formations. Infantry effectiveness declined markedly when troops lacked adequate winter clothing and shelter. Allied strategic responses to the German offensive demonstrated remarkable flexibility and coordination, despite initial tactical setbacks. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower immediately recognized the opportunity to inflict decisive defeats on German forces committed to exposed offensive positions. Rather than merely containing German advances, Allied strategy aimed at destroying Wehrmacht reserves that Germany could not afford to replace. The rapid redeployment of American armored formations from distant sectors proved crucial to ultimate Allied victory. General Patton's Third Army accomplished one of the most remarkable strategic movements in military history, pivoting 90 degrees and advancing over 100 miles through winter conditions to relieve Bastogne. This operational achievement required unprecedented coordination between multiple staff organizations. Allied air mobility capabilities, though limited by 1944 standards, played important roles in sustaining isolated garrisons throughout the battle zone. Transport aircraft flying dangerous nighttime missions delivered critical supplies to surrounded American forces. These operations required exceptional courage from aircrew members who faced intense anti-aircraft fire with minimal fighter escort protection. The cultural dimensions of American military effectiveness during the Battle of the Bulge reflected broader societal values that distinguished democratic nations from totalitarian adversaries. American soldiers fought not merely from professional obligation or fear of punishment, but from genuine commitment to ideals of freedom and individual dignity. This motivation proved sustainable under extreme stress conditions that broke less committed forces. Individual initiative at tactical levels repeatedly compensated for communication failures and unexpected situations throughout the battle. American non-commissioned officers and junior leaders demonstrated remarkable adaptability when separated from higher command authority. This decentralized leadership capability reflected training philosophies that emphasized individual responsibility within coordinated team efforts. The multinational character of Allied forces created both challenges and advantages during combat operations. Language barriers complicated coordination between American, British, and Belgian units operating in close proximity. However, the diversity of tactical approaches and technical expertise available within Allied formations provided flexibility that monolithic German organizations could not match. Technological innovation continued even during intensive combat operations, as maintenance crews and pilots developed field modifications that improved aircraft performance under winter conditions. Engine winterization procedures, cockpit heating systems, and modified ammunition loadings emerged from practical experience rather than formal engineering programs. These innovations were rapidly disseminated throughout operational units. The role of women in supporting combat operations, while largely overlooked in contemporary accounts, proved essential to sustained military effectiveness. Female personnel served as radio operators, intelligence analysts, weather forecasters, and medical staff at installations throughout the theater of operations. Their contributions enabled male personnel to focus on direct combat roles, while maintaining essential support services. Economic factors underlying military production capabilities became increasingly apparent as the battle progressed. American industrial capacity could sustain intensive combat operations indefinitely, while German manufacturing had reached maximum sustainable output levels months earlier. The mathematical relationship between national resources and military effectiveness was becoming undeniable. The integration of scientific research with immediate tactical requirements accelerated during winter combat conditions. Meteorological research stations provided weather data that directly impacted operational planning. Ballistics specialists analyzed enemy ammunition to improve defensive measures. Medical researchers studied cold weather injuries to develop more effective treatment protocols. Communication technologies available in 1944, while primitive by modern standards, enabled coordinated operations across multiple time zones and national boundaries. Radio networks connected tactical units with strategic headquarters, thousands of miles distant. Code-breaking capabilities provided intelligence that influenced tactical decisions within hours of enemy transmissions. The evolution of combined arms tactics during the Battle of the Bulge represented culmination of military doctrine development that had begun decades earlier. Artillery, armor, infantry, and aviation units operated with unprecedented coordination despite communication limitations and rapidly changing tactical situations. This integration multiplied combat effectiveness far beyond individual unit capabilities. Photographic documentation of combat operations provided historical records that would influence military training for generations. Combat photographers risked their lives to document tactical procedures, equipment performance, and individual heroism under actual battle conditions. These visual records became invaluable educational resources for future military personnel. Transportation networks supporting military operations required constant maintenance despite enemy interdiction efforts and harsh weather conditions. Railroad crews, truck drivers, and port workers maintained supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of contested territory. Their dedication under dangerous conditions enabled combat units to maintain operational effectiveness. The psychological impact of sustained combat on individual soldiers became increasingly apparent as operations continued beyond initial expectations. Medical personnel identified symptoms of combat exhaustion that required treatment before affected individuals became casualties. Military leadership adapted policies to maintain unit effectiveness while preserving human resources. Intelligence gathering operations during tactical combat required sophistication that challenged available technology and personnel resources. Photo interpretation specialists analyzed thousands of reconnaissance images to identify enemy positions and movements. Signal intelligence operators monitored enemy communications to provide tactical warnings. Human intelligence networks provided information that could not be obtained through technical means. The development of specialized winter warfare equipment demonstrated American industrial responsiveness to immediate tactical requirements. Cold-weather lubricants, improved heating systems, and modified ammunition emerged from accelerated research programs. These innovations were produced and distributed to operational units within weeks, rather than the months typically required for new equipment development. Cultural exchanges between Allied personnel from different nations created lasting impacts that extended beyond military cooperation. American soldiers stationed in England developed appreciation for European history and tradition. British personnel, working with American units, gained understanding of democratic ideals and individual initiative. These interactions influenced post-war international relations. As the winter sun set on December 24, 1944, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge had been fundamentally decided by the courage of pilots like Francis Gabreski and the technological superiority of American aviation. The German offensive that had begun with such promise would collapse within days, not merely from strategic overextension or logistical failures, but from the simple fact that clear skies had returned to the Ardennes. The strategic ramifications extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Hitler's decision to commit his last operational reserves to the Ardennes offensive represented the final squandering of Germany's remaining military potential. The Wehrmacht divisions destroyed during December 1944 could never be replaced, leaving Germany vulnerable to the massive Allied offensives that would follow in 1945. Soviet intelligence services closely monitored the Ardennes fighting, drawing conclusions about American military effectiveness that would influence post-war strategic calculations. The demonstration of Allied air-ground coordination capabilities convinced Soviet planners that direct confrontation with Western nations would require massive technological investments that challenged available Soviet resources. The human stories emerging from the Battle of the Bulge created cultural narratives that defined American attitudes toward military service for decades. Veterans returning home carried memories of comradeship, sacrifice, and ultimate victory that influenced their children's understanding of citizenship and national duty. These intergenerational transfers of values shaped American society throughout the Cold War period. European civilians who witnessed American military operations during the battle developed lasting appreciation for democratic values and individual freedom. The contrast between American soldiers who treated civilians with respect and German forces who requisitioned supplies without compensation created impressions that influenced European political development throughout the post-war period. The technical lessons learned during winter combat operations influenced aircraft design and operational procedures for years to come. Engineering modifications developed under combat conditions were incorporated into production aircraft that served during the Cold War. Tactical doctrines proven effective during the Ardennes fighting became standard training subjects at military schools worldwide. International law regarding aerial warfare evolved partly from precedents established during the Battle of the Bulge. The precise targeting of military objectives while avoiding civilian casualties demonstrated that discriminate use of air power was possible even under intense combat conditions. These precedents influenced legal frameworks governing armed conflict throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The Christmas miracle that saved Bastogne was ultimately a testament to the power of human courage operating within technological and organizational systems designed to maximize individual effectiveness. When Gabreski made his final radio transmission, he spoke not merely as an individual hero, but as the representative of an entire civilization committed to preserving human freedom against totalitarian oppression. The thunder of those radial engines over the Belgian forests on Christmas Eve 1944 announced more than tactical airstrikes against enemy vehicles. It proclaimed the arrival of a new era in which technological capabilities would be limited only by the moral courage of those who wielded such power. The young Americans who flew those missions carried within their hearts the hopes of millions who looked to the skies for deliverance. Today, as we face new challenges to freedom and human dignity, the example of pilots like Francis Gabreski reminds us that technology alone cannot preserve our cherished values. It requires individuals willing to make ultimate sacrifices in service of ideals greater than themselves. Their legacy lives on not merely in historical records, but in the continuing commitment of each generation to defend liberty against those who would destroy it. The restoration of Allied air superiority on December 24, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Within 5 months, Hitler would be dead, and the Third Reich would surrender unconditionally. But the price of that victory was measured in the lives of young men who gave everything they had to ensure that freedom would survive the darkest winter of the 20th century. Their sacrifice deserves our remembrance, our gratitude, and our commitment to preserving the ideals for which they fought. If this story has moved you, if you feel the weight of their sacrifice and the magnitude of their courage, please share this video with others who need to understand what freedom truly costs. Subscribe to ensure their memory lives on and that their stories continue to inspire future generations who may one day be called upon to demonstrate similar courage in defense of liberty and justice. The thunder of their engines has faded into history, but their legacy remains as powerful today as it was on that frozen Christmas Eve over the forests of Belgium. Remember them, honor them, and never let their sacrifice be forgotten.